Now, in spite of this white hair, which would suggest to you that I'm old, which I am, and experienced and wise, I tend to put too much into my presentations, and I always realize that when I print it out, and I look at it and think, how did I think I could get through all of that in the time? And that applies tonight. I'll do my very best, but Rupert, if you feel that you need to give me a wind-up signal, you just jump in and do that. You're the anchor. I don't mind going a bit longer, but I'm mindful of the time difference and what time it is in New Zealand. So, Rupert, you're the boss. Um, I will make a copy of the PowerPoint presentation available to you all via Rupert. So just so that you know that you'll get a copy of that. For those of you who've done Solar Lab short courses or other professional learning with me, there will be some revision. Revision, of course, is always a good thing. The science of learning tells us that revision is a good thing. So if you heard me before, there won't necessarily be new content tonight, but I hope that there's something of use to everyone. All right, so what I want to talk about is oral language as opposed to written language, the ways in which they are separate, but they also have a symbiotic, interconnected relationship. And I can see that something weird's happened with the formatting already there. But we'll talk about frameworks for thinking about reading, the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. We're going to look at a bit of history. We're going to look at vocabulary and in particular the idea of tiers of vocabulary and ways of teaching that. We'll look at morphology, what it is and how it can help. And we'll try to put this together in some sensible kind of way for reading comprehension. And I'll also share with you what I think are some valuable resources. So buckle up because we're going to go fairly fast. Okay, now I always like to start with some first principles, some key principles, some things that I think are immutable that should be written in, carved in stone in the side of a mountain that we can all turn to. We need to remember that oral language is biologically primary, but it's not set and forget. So we still do quite a lot of teaching and support and scaffolding of children's language development. But we humans have an evolutionary advantage for oral language. Reading, on the other hand, is biologically secondary, so it needs to be taught. So it's one of the things that children go to school in order to learn to read, write, and spell. We've evolved to have brains that can do those things, but they need to be taught. Writing systems are a recent invention in human evolutionary terms. We've had a writing systems for probably 3,000 to 5,000 years, which is about 3% of human existence. So it's just a blink in terms of evolution of the human brain. Knowledge of the history and workings of the English writing system, unfortunately, has been missing in action for teachers for decades, and that's because it's been missing in action from teacher initial education. So if I'm critical of anyone, it's of my colleagues in faculties of education. I'm not critical of teachers because teachers do things like what you're doing right now, which is logging in on your own time in the evening to know better and do better. So reading is a verb. It's something that children have to be demonstrably able to do, and it's different from literacy, which is a noun, and in many respects a somewhat abstract noun. So they're not synonymous terms. They're related, but they're not synonymous. Balanced literacy is very different from structured explicit literacy teaching. You'll notice I don't say it's very different from phonics because phonics instruction is only one part of structured explicit literacy teaching. And reading instruction should, of course, align with the broader science of learning, taking into account things like executive functions, attention, working memory, cognitive load, and so forth. So reading, the science of reading sits within something bigger that we know as the science of learning. So I want to talk now about oral language and written language, which I'm going to propose to you are separate, but they are symbiotic because writing systems were an add-on to the fact that we had spoken language, and there were it was decided that there were cultural, social, in many respects, commercial advantages to being able to write language down rather than just transact it in that very momentary sense in the here and now through spoken language. So language involves sending and receiving arbitrary symbols to represent meaning. Those symbols can be spoken words. So the sounds that you're hearing now coming out of my mouth are just acoustic signals that your brain is interpreting as words for a whole range of complicated reasons that we don't have time to go into tonight. Other examples of arbitrary symbols that represent language, that are forms of language, are written words, pictographs, and sign language. So this allows us to create an infinite number and range of utterances, of messages. This is how humans use language. It's rule governed, and these rules are implicit for native speakers, but they tend to need to be explicit when we're learning a second or additional language. It's not so easy for us to cash in on implicit learning twice. We get to do implicit learning once when we're learning our home language, but when we want to learn another language, we typically have to go the explicit path. And part of our work in the Solar Lab is really to try and improve the explicit knowledge of teachers around language. You all have good implicit knowledge of language, but it's helpful when you're working with novices and wanting to make them proficient to have an explicit knowledge. And of course, language allows us to describe phenomena that are not physically present. It's conceptual, it's abstract. When speech pathologists talk about oral language, they're talking about everyday talking skills, expressive skills, what I'm using at the moment, as well as listening or receptive comprehension skills, what you're drawing on at the moment, and of course all the mental stuff that they represent. Otherwise, we would literally only be talking about artificial intelligence. So language is a carriage system for thoughts, ideas, beliefs, wishes, everything that goes on inside our head. Language is the carriage system that gets it out of our head and able to be shared with other people. Language, of course, has lots of layers, and we don't have time to get into all of these tonight, but it's got a structural, literal level where words mean exactly what they seem to mean. There's quite a one-to-one correspondence. It's got a figurative, non-literal level where we're using idioms and figurative language and metaphor and sarcasm. It's got a discourse level, so we can talk about conversational discourse, narrative discourse, expository discourse. This is different kinds of connected talk, if you like. It's got a metalinguistic level, which is using language to talk about language, and I guess that's what I'm doing right now. This is a metalinguistic activity, me sitting here using language to talk about language. But it's also metalinguistics when we explain the basis of a joke, which might be a pun, for example. That's using metalinguistic skills. And then it's got a pragmatic level, which is knowledge of how we need to adjust our communication style according to the situation and the context that we're in. Now, in various different ways, these are all relevant to the transition to literacy and to the ongoing progress that we want students to make through primary and secondary years. Again, we don't have time to do that deep dive tonight, but we do need to recognise that language is much more than just words. My mouse, here we go. And language is also something of a paradox. So whilst I've said that it's something that's biologically primary, we've got a human evolutionary advantage for oral language. Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, says we have a language instinct and we don't have a reading instinct. We've got a brain that can learn to read, but we don't have a reading instinct. So it's all those wonderful things that have a big biological evolutionary advantage. However, paradoxically, it's also highly vulnerable, and it's vulnerable to a wide range of developmental conditions, some of which you can see listed here. Most obviously, of course, developmental language disorder, which, by the way, is far more common, and it's not a competition, but it's far more common than, say, autism. And there's good epidemiological evidence to show that in a class of 30, there will be typically 2 children who meet diagnostic criteria for DLD. And the other 28 don't all have necessarily fantastic language skills. There are going to be, this is a continuum, and there are going to be other children with weak language skills too. And it's very sensitive to environmental exposure, so to the kind of language experiences that children have at home and in preschool and daycare settings. So it's not set and forget. It's biologically primary, but it's not set and forget. Now, if we have a think about what happens when 2 people are having a conversation and using language to transact the business of everyday life, we often need to do a lot of inferencing. We know inferencing is important in reading because it would be awful for us as readers if writers explicitly spelt out everything about what they're writing about, particularly in fictional texts. We quite like things to be spelled out in non-fictional expository textbooks, but in fiction, we don't want everything spelled out. But when we're just talking to each other, we get a lot of support in the business of inferencing. We're supported by real-time context, by facial expression, by tone of voice, opportunities to clarify, to check in. We're supported by the fact that we're often co-constructing the interaction, finishing each other's sentences, taking each other down different segues, conversational segues, and we typically have shared background knowledge. So there's a lot that supports our ability to send and receive messages via spoken communication. But as we'll see, it gets a bit harder when we get into written communication. Spoken language and written language are similar, but they have some very important differences. So as we've just seen, oral language often involves co-construction. It's often quite messy. There's pauses and hesitations and false starts because we're doing it in real time. And we're processing, thinking about what the other person's saying, thinking about what we're going to say, and we stumble a lot, and that's fine. It's constrained, of course, by pragmatic or social conventions, so the degree of formality varies. You may not have given any thought to the fact that I'm not getting to the end of a sentence and saying full stop, and I don't pose a rhetorical question to you and say question mark, because when we're talking, we use tone of voice to signal the end of a sentence. An upward intonation says I'm asking a question. And I also don't put spaces between words when I talk because I don't need to. Your brains do this clever thing that I'm not sure whether it was Kate Burridge or Steven Pinker who said this. I think I read it in something of Kate Burridge's, that our brains hallucinate the word boundaries. So what your brain is hearing is a continuous acoustic stream, but your brain is able to insert the word boundaries until you do something like turn on the SBS World News and hear someone speaking in a language that you're completely unfamiliar with. And now you're back to hearing a continuous acoustic stream and your brain's got no idea where the word boundaries are. So they're a function of our familiarity with the oral language. Written language, however, is typically, not necessarily, more formal. That varies according to genre. Now, in most cases, we don't have the messy stuff because writers can edit and re-edit and re-edit. Importantly, written language often includes syntactic structures, sentence structures that are more complex, longer. They often will see embedded sentences, so relative clauses, subordinate clauses. We might see the passive voice more in writing than the active voice and more than is used in spoken language. And this is because writers know that their readers can go back and reread until they understand, until they make sense of it. We don't want to be doing that every sentence. But writers know that they can load us up a bit more linguistically because we make the pace. Where in conversation, we tend to take account of the fact that it's all happening in real time, and once a word's spoken, it's gone. And so we try not to overload each other. Now we do have punctuation, and that's because it helps the writer to convey meaning. Punctuation is part of the meaning system, and it simply makes it easier for the reader. Of course, spelling and grammar can change meaning. You've all seen the social media meme that says, "Let's eat grandma." And as a grandma, I'm very fond of the comma in that statement, statement, so that I know that I'm being invited to dinner and that I'm not dinner. So very important for students to know that spelling and grammar are part of the meaning system. And also, we now have spaces between words to show the word boundaries. And that's because originally, when the scribes first started writing spoken language down, they thought their job was just to write down what they were hearing. And they wrote using a thing called scripta continua, which just means continuous script. And you can easily do a Google image search and find examples of that. And what they found was that their consumer feedback told them that it was really hard for people to read. Now, the first paragraph here you might find a little bit easier than the second paragraph, because the first paragraph, once you start looking at it, you might recognise as the opening of A Tale of Two Cities, if you've read that. And so once you know that, it's a little bit easier, but you're going to find the second paragraph harder because you don't have any prior knowledge. So reading without the spaces between the words just increases the cognitive load. Our ears can do it. Our ears don't need spaces between words because of that biologically primary aspect of language. But our eyes need spaces between words because reading and writing are biologically secondary. We also need to think about the nature of our writing system. Now, when I work with people face to face, I love having this conversation about what this word orthography means, just because I love words and studying words. But in the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase and tell you that the word part ortho means right, R-I-G-H-T, or correct. And graphy means writing, W-R-I-T-I-N-G. So orthography, or orthography, as we now say it, means right writing, the correct writing system for a language. So many languages have a written form, and when they have a written form, they have an orthography, a correct way of being written down, or an accepted way of being written down. Now, English, as many of you would know, has been a bowerbird historically. It's just pinched words from wherever it's wanted to pinch them, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And when the early scribes first started writing language down, there wasn't a lot of uniformity in how they did that, and how they mapped phonemes to graphemes. For a wide range of reasons, we now say that English has a semi-transparent orthography. So we're not a language like French or Italian or Spanish that has a nice transparent writing system, and where teachers need to spend probably only about 6 months of the first year of school teaching children how their writing system works. We've got a complex writing system, and we dedicate the best part of the first 3 years of school to helping children understand that system. Now, don't let anyone tell you that our writing system is random. It's not. It's governed by etymological patterns and rules, and spelling gets a bad rap here, but spelling is not the culprit. It's not the problem. The culprit is shifts in pronunciation, and those shifts in pronunciation have occurred over time. The Great Vowel Shift is probably the most famous example of that, but they also occur in space geographically, and nowhere is that more evident perhaps than in a presentation that's shared between Aussies and Kiwis. Because as soon as we start opening our mouths, we know that there are pronunciation differences. We spell the words the same way, but we say them differently. So knowledge of etymology, of course, really helps teachers to demystify these conventions, and it makes it easier for teachers to take novices across the bridge to proficiency. So our writing system is a code for spoken language, like all writing systems. We happen to have an imperfect code, arguably the most complex alphabetic writing system in the world. So it's an orthographically deep alphabet that we have. And we encode both sound, phonology, and meaning, morphology, in our writing system. So we say we have a morphophonemic language. It certainly has some alphabetic features. It's great to start with those in initial reading instruction, but it's not 100% transparent. I always like to remind people that academic scholars have been and continue to tinker with the English writing system for centuries, but we take 5-year-olds and give them 36 months to master its workings. And after that, things do become quite hit and miss. If you haven't mastered if you don't have the constrained aspects of the writing system under your belt after the first 3 years of school, then you are in many cases on a trajectory away from academic achievement and a trajectory away from being a proficient reader and writer. So all students have to be able to work with what is sometimes called the simple and the complex code. Not everyone loves that language. I think it's quite useful as a starting point for initial reading instruction, because decoding is a non-negotiable skill and is one key to comprehension. It's not enough on its own, but it's one vital key to comprehension. We can decode something that we can't understand. So I can still decode things written in French because I did 6 years of French at school, but I've forgotten a lot of my vocabulary, so I won't necessarily be able to understand it. However, we can't understand something that we can't decode. So if I was to take up learning modern Greek, which has its own very different orthography from the one that we use, I'm going to get nowhere unless I understand how that writing system works. And of course, our 5-year-olds get nowhere when they don't understand how their writing system works. So I think I've probably covered most of this already. When people say, "Oh, English is a random language; it's all over the place," linguists have actually spent time studying this, and they do what's called corpus linguistics. They study vast thousands of words. And what they've shown is that about 50% of words in English are directly decodable from their written form. A further 36% violate only one sound letter rule, and the culprit here is usually a vowel. 10% can be spelt correctly if morphology and etymology are taken into account, and fewer than 4% qualify to be called truly irregular. And we do hear that word irregular thrown around a lot, and a lot more, I would say, than it should be. And I would argue that we should be thinking about regularity on a continuum, not as a binary. Words are not regular or irregular. There's a continuum of regularity. Okay, so our students then who can't decode efficiently, and remembering that the nature of decoding changes in the secondary years, but it's still decoding. If students are on track with their reading in the secondary years, we want them to be finding their way through polysyllabic, multimorphemic words. That's still decoding. But if you can't decode, whether you're in grade 2 or year 8, then you're facing a closed door when it comes to accessing the meaning of text. If you can decode efficiently and effectively, especially after 3 years of formal schooling, so that you're essentially within reason in terms of the complexity of the text and the background knowledge that is required. But once you can pick up any text and not be reliant on pictures and other cues, you're walking down the corridors of power into infinity once you've got that level of automaticity, because we've taken the constrained skills out of the mix and given you access to the meaning of the text. So sometimes people want to get, I would say, a little bogged down in talking about working on comprehension strategies for students who are weak readers. And unfortunately, that's going to be putting everyone on a hiding to nowhere. So why are strong decoding and word identification skills essential for primary and secondary students? I would go no further than the words of Anita Archer, who reminds us there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read the words. So it doesn't matter what your bag of tricks is in terms of comprehension strategies as a teacher. If the students can't read the words, finding the main idea, underlining, summarising, none of those things are going to help if they can't get the words off the page. They're still facing that closed door. So when students start school, we ask them to cross a metaphorical bridge. And as you can see here, it's represented as a somewhat precarious bridge because it is precarious. And if children don't get across that bridge in that critical 36 months that we've talked about, then in English-speaking countries, they're in quite a bit of strife. Now, on the near bank, we've got everything oral language in the first 5 years of school, of life. But of course, we also want to be exposing children to print and reading to them and so forth. But the first 5 years of life are predominantly about that language explosion that occurs in expressive and receptive language skills. But after 3 years of formal schooling, we need children to be on the far bank and demonstrating proficiency in reading, writing, and spelling. Now, they haven't learned everything that they need to know about reading, writing, and spelling, but they need to understand how this writing system of ours works so that they can lift words off the page. And they need to be able to do that with a level of automaticity and efficiency that promotes comprehension, because reading fluency, which is rate, accuracy, and prosody or expression, is one of the strongest predictors of reading comprehension. There are other predictors as well, but fluency has been described as the bridge, if you like, between decoding and comprehension. Now, I think it's fair to say that there wouldn't be anyone online tonight that would disagree with the idea that oral language abilities in the early years and beyond are profoundly important for making the transition to reading, to getting across that bridge, becoming a proficient reader, and understanding what you're reading. I mean, take me on if you like, but I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the importance of that arrow. However, I don't think we spend enough time talking about this other arrow down the bottom, which speaks to us about how reading abilities pay it back to oral language development, to ongoing oral language development. So by the time children are in year 3, we want them to be proficient readers who are value adding their oral language vocabularies by being exposed to new words through their own reading. We can't push enough higher order vocabulary, that higher order sort of literate language, into our everyday conversations with children. It's just not possible. They have to be exposed to that more literate language through reading. And of course, the big clue that is happening is kids dropping words into conversation and mispronouncing them. And it's just the most delightful, magical thing, because they innocently and very confidently put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and everyone laughs and, you know, thinks it's a great joke. But that child is telling us, I've added to my oral language vocabulary all by myself because I'm a reader. They're also, by the way, as we said earlier, being exposed to more complex vocabulary, sentence structure, background knowledge. They're having to work their way through idioms and figurative language. So the children who are reading really embody that idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, the Matthew principle that you might have heard about. It's a biblical reference from the Old Testament. That if you get out of the blocks early and efficiently, you take off. But if you struggle initially, then the gap between you and your more proficient peers is just going to get wider and wider over time. So let's remember that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. All right, so what has world history got to do with reading and reading instruction? Well, quite a lot as it happens. And any of you who have already done a bit of a deep dive into world history in relation to language and reading will know how rewarding that is and how many light bulb moments it offers. So now, of course, we're talking about etymology, which is a branch of linguistics, and it's the study of word origins and derivations as opposed to entomology. So if you came here tonight to talk about insects, you're in the wrong Zoom meeting, people. Find the other link. That's not what we're talking about. Mind you, that word insect is an interesting one to take apart in itself, and to discover what word family it belongs to. Sect means cut, so we get the word sect as in a group of people who are cut away from other people. Dissect, bisect. And an insect is so named because it's cut, it looks like it's cut into sections. So in English, this involves us understanding that we've incorporated many words from many languages, and of course, it's closely tied to the study of world history. Now, on the face of things, it's easy to think, well, this country called England is the place that gave us the English language. And that's really only partially true. Yes, England gave us the English language, but that came about via a process of wars, trade, intermarrying of royal houses, the influence of religion, the Black Death was a significant player in the history of English, the advent of the printing press. There are so many factors that have contributed to how English became the language that it is, such that I think it's actually much more useful for us to use the metaphor of a melting pot when we think about the English language. And if we think back over the last 2,000 years, you can see these major waves of migration, if you like, that have impacted English. I won't go right back to, won't talk tonight about Celtic tribes, and the Celts didn't leave a large footprint on English except for place names. And then, of course, England was part of the Roman Empire for around 300 years. Then we had Anglo-Saxon and Viking invasions. And as we'll see in a moment, something really big happened in 1066 that meant that the French ruled in England for 300 years. And in fact, and linguists argue about this, but some say as many as 45% of words in English come from French. Some of them came from Latin via French. And in the Renaissance and period age of enlightenment, a lot of words were pushed into English also by scholars from Latin. And there have been many other influences on English as well. But this really significant event that occurred in 1066 happened here at the Battle of Hastings. And this is a photo that I took back in July when my husband and I were on holidays in the UK. It was quite an amazing nerdy day for Nerdy Pam to go to Hastings and see the place where the English language was transformed. And as I said, for 300 years, French was the language of power, the language of influence, the language of government. England was effectively a trilingual country for 300 years. So the peasants spoke what we now call Middle English, and the clergy spoke Latin. And in fact, had it not been for the Black Death and the crushing effect that had on feudalism, and the fact that the French ultimately retreated as a consequence of the collapse social and political structures as a consequence of the Black Death, we would probably still be speaking French today. But English essentially rose up like a phoenix out of the ashes after the advent of the Black Death. That means that we can look at lots of common expressions and words that we have now that come from some of these interesting backgrounds. Someone once said that English didn't so much borrow words from other languages as chase other languages down dark alleys and rifle through their pockets looking for loose words. And I think that's a really nice description of how we've been very greedy, but it also means that we now have a very big vocabulary, and that creates opportunities and challenges for students. So you can see listed here really just a pretty random off the top of my head list of words that are of Greek origin. There are many, many more words in English that are of French origin, but that's just a small sample there. There's some words that come to us from Latin. And you might be surprised to see how many common everyday words actually have Nordic origins, words that we, and especially as it happens, a lot of words that relate to the weather and to elements have Nordic derivations. So I think it's useful then to take this historical lens and ask ourselves, what does it mean for morphology, for the structure, for the study of the structure of words and word components, bases, and the prefixes and suffixes that we add to them to change their meaning, which in many cases also change their spelling, and it's helpful for students to be explicitly taught some of those spelling conventions, like doubling a final consonant when we add an ing or an ed ending, for example. We can also, that's there in the next slide for spelling conventions, but also pronunciation shifts. So sometimes when we add morphemes, the pronunciation changes. So if you take the word like a word like expire, which is a verb, and turn it into a noun, expiration, you can see that the stress pattern has changed in that word. We don't say expiration, we say expiration. And most of those pronunciation shifts simply reflect that we humans do what's easiest for us. That's why we don't say in a word like mopped, M-O-P-P-E-D, we don't anymore say I mopped the floor, because it's easier to say mopped. But that creates a problem for children when they're trying to write that down, because what do they typically do? Write M-O-P-T, beautifully representing all of the phonemes that they're hearing, but showing us that they haven't learned the orthographic convention that when we're representing the past tense ed, that there's a way that we write that even when we're hearing it as t. And of course, there's a linguistic explanation for that too, because the preceding sound is voiceless. If you try saying that now, you're not making voice. And so it's easier for us to follow a voiceless sound with another voiceless sound, which is how we end up with mopped rather than mopped, which involves a bit more effort. And humans don't like effort if they can avoid it. And then, of course, we've got this thing called shades of meaning, which we do in English like no other language, because of our massive importation of words from French and Latin and Greek in particular. And this is something that British historian Melvyn Bragg has written about in his wonderful book called The Adventure of English. And there's also, I think it's a 6-part BBC series that you can pick up on YouTube by the same name, The Adventure of English. Those of you who are interested in the history of English, I do really strongly recommend that you pick this up and just watch it. It's really enjoyable and really informative. So Bragg said the extensive range of what I call almost synonyms became one of the glories of the English language, giving it astonishing precision and flexibility, allowing its speakers and writers over the centuries to discover what seemed to be exactly the right word. So let's have a look at what this looks like in action. Your friend Dave is upset because he's had a letter from his boss. You're going to respond differently to Dave because of your knowledge of the English language, according to which adjective he provides to you about how he's feeling. So these are all negative emotions that could all apply in this situation, but your knowledge of shades of meaning is going to help you to respond empathically to him, because English just has this incredible buffet of words that we can choose from. But as I said a moment ago, that creates opportunities as well as challenges, and particularly challenges for students from a reading comprehension perspective, and also for developing their own writing. Now, if we go back to just for a moment to 1066 and all that, there's a bar here, and you might be wondering, why does she put a line there? That's to represent what an education academic by the name of David Corson referred to as the lexical bar. And I always joke that if when I retire, I open a little watering hole, it will be called the lexical bar. So just remember that I got there first, okay? I probably won't open a watering hole when I retire, but I do like the idea of calling it the lexical bar. Now, what this shows us is that the words that have been in English for a very long time are now, in the 21st century, common everyday words. They're often short words, simple words. They're often words that have somewhat more transparent spelling patterns, and we refer to those as tier 1 words. The lexical bar is the divide between those common everyday words and the more literate, higher order language that came into English as a consequence of the Norman invasion in 1066, and things that happened subsequently, particularly during the age of Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and the deliberate construction of words from Latin and Greek roots in order to make English a more respectable written language. And scholars were wanting to move away from only writing in Latin. They had to tizzy English up and make it look more formal. And they did that by creating words out of Latin and Greek roots. Some of those have survived and some of them haven't. So what did Corson mean by the lexical bar? He said to look at the impact that students' life histories have on their learning and use of academic English words. And one starting point is the commonplace fact that the vocabulary of English falls into two very different categories. There's a striking incompatibility between Anglo-Saxon, on the one hand, words and Greco-Latin elements in English. So we've got the familiar, homely sounding and typically very short words that we learn very early in life and we use for everyday purposes. And then we've got the more learned, foreign sounding and characteristically rather long words that are used for academic purposes. So this idea of the lexical bar, I think, is incredibly important for reading comprehension, for writing, and for students accessing the academic curriculum. So that leads us then to the idea of vocabulary and tiers of vocabulary, and ways of teaching those. Now, some of you will already be familiar with this, this conceptual framework. Now, the framework comes from Isabel Beck and her colleagues. My creation of this triangle is mine. I'm not sure that from what I've seen on social media, Isabel Beck necessarily likes the framework being represented this way. So I just don't want to imply that that's her work. The idea of tiers of vocabulary, though, definitely is. But I think it's useful to think of the bulk of the words that we have and use in everyday life are commonly occurring tier 1 words that children learn through conversations with adults. Then we've got tier 2 words that they experience through text exposure, and in many cases they're French and or Latin in derivation. And then we've got subject-specific words that that students really only learn through curriculum exposure by being taught. So you're probably not going to stumble across the word isosceles in everyday conversation, but you will in a maths class. And a lot of those words, of course, are Greek in origin. And we can come back and think about Corson's lexical bar sitting between tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 words on the other side, and remind ourselves of the importance of students getting across that bar. So just to come back to it in the way that I represented it a moment ago, we've essentially got life starter pack, if you like, on the left of the lexical bar. But what school needs to provide access to is you've always got to pay more if you want to get past the starter pack, and you've got to put more effort in to get past the starter pack. And this is the tier 2 and then tier 3 vocabulary. So then we can think about our levels of knowledge of a word. And again, this comes from the work of Isabel Beck and her colleagues and Naji and Scott, who said we can talk about a word that we've never heard before. We can talk about having a general sense of a word, so knowing that the word mendacious, for example, has a negative connotation, but not actually knowing what it means. Having a narrow context-bound knowledge, so knowing that the word deciduous is something to do with plants, but I don't know what. And then we get to level 4, where we know the word well. Excuse me, we can define it, and we know when it's being misused and it's not reliant on context. I hate it when my husband calls out from another room, "What does such and such mean?" And I have to say, put it in a sentence, because that tells me immediately I've lost. Because I don't have level 4 knowledge of that word. Not that I'm competitive or anything, but that tells me if I need context, that I'm not quite there with my knowledge of how that word works. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to do this. This is always a fun thing to do, but maybe you can test yourselves. Perhaps you could put in the chat, are there any words there that you would give yourself that you would, a level 1, where you would say, no, I have never heard that word before? I'll just have a quick look in the chat and see what's coming up. Okay, Adam Brait's getting a lot of votes. You might be interested to know that there's a very common word that's related to Adam Brait, and that's umbrella, and which comes from a base meaning shadow. And when you adumbrate something, you outline it. There's a medical term, penumbra, which sometimes comes up on radiology reports when they talk about the shadow around a tumour. Okay, all right. Yeah, words are cool. You're right, Sean. I hope I'm saying your name correctly there. So this is always a fun thing to do, fun little party game. And then you can get to pronouncing them as well, because we've all had that moment, haven't we, of saying a word that, like the kids that I was referring to before, but saying a word that we haven't heard but we've seen written. And it's not uncommon for adults to talk about hyperbole or epitome. And yes, Rupert's giving what it feels like when you do that, and we've all been there, we've all done it. Okay, so how do we teach these really important tier 2 words? Well, first of all, we need to remember that the notion of tiers is arbitrary. It's just a conceptual framework. It's just meant to be something that's helpful for teachers. There's not a list carved into the side of a mountain somewhere that says these are always tier 1 words, these are always tier 2 words. It's helpful to start with words that are in text that the students are already reading. You can use published word lists, but you need to think about how relevant they are for your students culturally. And be conscious of your own language. I've been in prep classrooms where I've seen fantastic modelling of tier 2 language, just completely opportunistically by the teacher. Can you please put your bags adjacent to the door? Adjacent means next to. What a beautiful way of just dropping tier 2 language in. That teacher could have just said, put your bags next to the door, but he chose to teach adjacent really seamlessly without doing a lesson on the word adjacent, because we need to hear words quite a few times in order to get them knitted into our long-term memory. What are some other things we can do? We can incorporate tier 2 words into everyday classroom discourse, be playful with words, talking about puns and jokes, be explicit about polysemy. Polysemy is the phenomenon in English whereby lots of common tier 1 words have multiple meanings. Their spelling doesn't change, but their meaning does. Now, the example I often use here is the word bank, which is somewhere where you take your money or somewhere that takes your money, depending on how cynical you are. The side of a river. It can be what you do when you rely on someone. It can be a maneuver that an aeroplane does, and it no doubt has other meanings as well. So same little word, pronunciation doesn't change, spelling doesn't change, but the meaning changes. And often students have one meaning of these polysemous words in their long-term memory, and they read the word used in a different way, and it throws them from a comprehension perspective. Using morphology and etymology to pull words apart and help students to see patterns and find word families, using published resources, focus on teaching that builds a decontextualised mastery of literate language. So we don't want to be reliant on context. We want, if you know what the word adumbrate means, you know what it means regardless of the context in which it's used. So that means we've got to remember that dictionaries have denotative meanings, which is their strict literal meanings of words, if you like. But in everyday life, we're dealing with connotative meanings. So speakers and writers add their own connotation to a word that can change its meaning. So it's important that we're being curious and teaching curiosity. Now, Rupert, this is the point in the presentation where I start to think, I think I'm probably run out of time.
No, and I'm just sort of gently pointing that it is almost sort of the hour, but I mean, I think people are more than happy to continue hearing this really practical insight. So I'm not sort of trying to wrap you up at all, Pam, but I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Okay.
Just so, yeah.
All right. I reckon I can probably wrap up in about 10.
Great.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. So the next question then is, how do decoding skills and vocabulary knowledge contribute to reading comprehension? Because obviously at the end of the day, reading comprehension is our game. But one of the follies, I guess, of whole language and balanced literacy has been the idea that because reading is about meaning, we start with meaning. And that's like saying when we teach a child a musical instrument that playing the cello is about being able to play the Vivaldi cello sonata. So that's where we'll start. And of course, we can't start there with something as complex as playing music any more than we can with something as complex as reading. Now, if you're not familiar with Nancy Lewis Hennessy's 2021 book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint, I do strongly recommend that you get hold of it. And she has recently co-authored a workbook with Julia, someone whose surname I can't remember, but it's a partner text to this book. This is a very, very practical, teacher-friendly book about reading comprehension. Now, this is just a little infographic, I suppose, that I've put together because she uses the lovely analogy of reading comprehension being like a factory. And you have to have all these different processes and events occurring on a production line in order for reading comprehension to roll off the end after all of those processes have occurred. So everything from word level identification through to knowledge of word meaning, sentence level comprehension, text level comprehension, background knowledge, those things together give us reading comprehension. So you remember earlier we were saying how many advantages we've got in spoken language when we were talking about inferencing, drawing out the meaning, inferring or drawing in really the meaning. When we infer, we draw in, which is different from implying, which is suggesting to someone else indirectly. So we get a lot of scaffolds in everyday conversation, but when we're reading, it's so much harder because now we don't have that interpersonal space. We've got to do all the work ourselves. Typically, we get to rely less on well-worn sort of cliched phrases that we use when we're talking to each other, especially if we're reading fiction, because the mark of a good fiction writer, of course, is that they use language in very idiosyncratic, creative ways that we've never encountered before. Background knowledge is important, and knowledge of language structure is important. So knowing that a pronoun has a referent, that it's referring back, a he or a she is referring to someone who's already been named in the text. So what compromises conversation? Now, this is a quote from 25 years ago. I'm not the Snow that I'm quoting. It's Catherine Snow from Harvard University and her colleagues who said, comprehension will suffer if a word has been incorrectly recognised, if the text includes words that are not in the reader's oral vocabulary, if the linguistic structure of the sentence is overly complex, or if the topic of the reading material is so unfamiliar that the reader cannot make inferences or read between the lines that are necessary to understanding the text. So this is a beautiful segue then to this question, how do we teach comprehension? Well, guess what? We've got to be teaching all of these things. If we go back to Nancy Lewis Hennessy's analogy of the factory, we've got to be making sure that every step along the way, every element in that assembly line is being done really well. So we've got to have decoding, we've got to have vocabulary, we've got to have sentence structure, we've got to have background knowledge, the topic of the reading, and the ability to draw inferences. So this is how we teach comprehension, by thinking about this, going back to the analogy and all of the components, rather than just relying on so-called comprehension strategies. Now, that's not to say that strategies don't have a place, but we can't be ignoring these critical elements. I think it's also important to remember that we want, especially our beginning readers, but this applies probably across the lifespan, to be using context for deriving meaning, not for identifying words. And this is because, again, as Snow and colleagues commented, if we look at skilled readers, they don't try to work out an unfamiliar word by guessing it on the basis of context. That's not how skilled readers try to get an unfamiliar word off the page, because they know that decoding, even if they're not going to get it right the first time, decoding is a better bet than using context to guess an unfamiliar word. And statistically, we know that there's actually only a slim chance of guessing a word correctly from context clues alone, because there's so many things that it could be. And that applies to adults as well. So I am very close to wrapping up. The challenge for teachers then is that we want students to be reading more complex texts. In order to do that, they need rich vocabulary exposure. However, in order to acquire rich vocabulary, remember that bottom arrow, we had the two circles, students need to be able to read complex texts. And I'm pretty sure that this article by Marilyn Jager Adams is open access, and I do recommend that you have a look at that because she deals with this issue really beautifully. What all of us need to be doing, of course, is doing everything that we can to remove barriers to success. So that means we need to be considering both sides of the simple view of reading, the decoding or word recognition side, and the language comprehension side. Or you can think conceptually about the reading rope, if that's better, and building background knowledge. Of course, the background knowledge is a part of the reading rope, but I think it warrants consideration in its own right. And this is all because when we think about reading success and reading struggle, we've really got a perfect storm on our hands because a lot hinges on being able to read. It happens to be very important. It's a biologically unnatural skill. It draws on the strength and integrity of the oral language system. It needs to be taught, and the oral language system itself can be fragile. Once children start to fall behind, as you know, it becomes exponentially more difficult to catch them up, and there's not many schools that have got the resources to do that properly. Then there are behavioural and emotional consequences for children who are struggling. Hands up everybody who works in a school who's got the resources to deal with those. But we know when we apply something like response to intervention, which is a public health prevention framework, we can actually head off a lot of these difficulties at the first pass by teaching well and getting it right from the start. And that's because, to my mind, high quality reading instruction and producing proficient readers is a hugely important social justice imperative that allows all children to be part of the social and economic mainstream, regardless of their starting point. So, Rupert, if I can just put in a quick shameless plug for our Solo Lab short courses, which people can find by doing a Google search. If you're not familiar with the work of Christopher Such, I do strongly recommend that you have a look at his first book came out, I think, around 2021, 2022, and he's just this year released his second one. I certainly don't make anything out of plugging his work. And guess what? He doesn't either, because all of the profits from his books go to malaria research, which makes it, I think, even more worthwhile to support him. And I've also, they're the subjects that are covered in our grad cert, new grad cert in language and literacy, and which you can see here. And these are some books that I think are really useful for teachers, really written in a very classroom-friendly way. So that's Beck and colleagues, Lynn Stone, many of you will be familiar with Lynn's work, Marcia Henry's Unlocking Literacy, that's the reading comprehension blueprint that I referred to, Louisa Moats's Speech to Print, and that's how you can keep in contact with me. And I will stop sharing. Sorry, I did push the envelope a bit there on time.
Not at all. I don't think anyone's worried about that.
Very happy to take some questions. Have anyone disagree with me? And hello, Leah. It's just a familiar face.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pam. What an incredible talk, sort of bridging the theoretical, the historical, and then into the practical. I think just speaks to your, incredible just knowledge and expertise in this space. And I'm sure people got a lot out of that in terms of, the base level knowledge and, but also what they can actually do in their classroom to support their learners. So, it made me think about the students I had and the importance of oral language that they didn't have access to, which could have helped them navigate complex social situations, behavioral issues, any stress in the classroom, and just the way that reading can enrich that part of their life is so, so crucial. So, it was really, really amazing food for thought and helped me sort of reframe some things too. So thank you. If you have, I could listen to you talk all evening, Pam. So someone wrote, so, I think a lot of people echo that. So if you have 5 minutes to hang around for some questions, that would be wonderful. If anyone has anything they'd like to maybe pop in the chat and I can read it out, rather than, it might be the easiest way to do it, rather than several people coming off mute at once and, sort of getting a wall of sound. So if anything. While people are typing, just on pronunciation, it makes me think of in Kath and Kim, where instead of describing herself as affluent, Kath describes herself as effluent, which is a good example of what a difference a letter makes.
There are so many gold moments in that series.
What do you think? So Sean's written, when do you think the biggest shift in the research around teaching reading in Australia occurred? In other words, how quickly is the field changing and how can we keep up?
Well, I'd say, Sean, we probably of recent times stopped spinning the wheels. If you think back to the fact that our national inquiry into the teaching of literacy is going to turn 20 next year, and no state or territory adopted any of the 20 recommendations of that report, which, if you dusted them off today and did nothing else, would be a very, very good starting point, even though there's been another 20 years of research that's only further really consolidated those recommendations. So I do think that we're moving, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. Some of the best research in this area was done in the 1960s when I was at primary school. If you look at the work of Jean Chall, for example, she was sitting in, if she'd been in Australia, she could have been sitting in my classroom when I was learning how to read. And if you read the work of Jean Chall, um, that it's very good work that is very applicable today. So, yes, I think we've stopped spinning the wheels, but boy, we can't afford to take our eye off the horizon or the dashboard in the next decade because we really need a very, very sustained effort. And I don't think in the case of Australia, and I suspect probably across the ditch in New Zealand, Rupert, I don't think our faculties of education are really on the bus just yet. And it makes me cross that so much of the change that's occurring is occurring on the ground because of the efforts of teachers who've already paid for a teaching degree that in many cases wasn't fit for purpose, and then they've had to go and pay again to learn stuff that they should have learnt the first time round. So I want to see education academics getting on the bus because otherwise we're going to be, I often use the metaphor with reading of building fences at the top of the cliff or parking ambulances down the bottom. Well, we're going to be parking ambulances down the bottom in terms of what teachers need to do unless we build those better fences at the top of the cliff. Now, Shan, I hope I'm answering your question.
Thank you. Now the questions are coming in thick and fast. So I think in the interest of time, I mean, we might just take one more. Does that sound, yeah, is that okay with you, Pam?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm happy to, yeah. I just think, also you probably have your evening to get back to. So,
Well, I'm not cooking dinner, and if we keep going, I won't have to clean up either.
oh,
So.
okay. Well, then, okay. Well, yeah, we can push on and people can jump off the call as they need, I suppose, as well. Sue's asked about what resources you would recommend for secondary school teachers to include literacy skills in their subject area. Such a really big problem point, I think, for a lot of secondary educators.
Yeah, look, I've got a sort of a two-speed answer to that question. I think we need to be addressing the upstream issue first, which is ensuring that primary schools aren't sending so many kids through to year 7 with reading skills around year 2, year 3 level. So that's where we need to start. And I think secondary schools talking to their feeder primary schools about the 5 from 5 reading pledge is a really good way to start that conversation and talking about what it would mean to be ensuring that the vast majority of children going into year 7 are proficient readers, writers and spellers. But then we need a bit of a mindset change for secondary teachers around the idea that, it's everybody's job to teach reading and writing and spelling, and everybody can be creating safe places in their classroom for some things to be read aloud, even doing some choral reading of new vocabulary. So everybody saying the word isosceles aloud while they're looking at it on the board, while they're writing it down, practicing spelling it. There is, I think, some low-hanging fruit for secondary teachers that can make their teaching more rewarding But of course, it entails some effort as well in terms of perhaps a little bit of upskilling in our own knowledge of the English writing system and word origins and so forth. But we can't be having a situation where this is all just on the English teachers, because guess what? Secondary English teachers didn't learn how to teach reading either. And so we have to, you go back to that old poem about everybody, somebody, nobody. Everybody has to share the heavy lifting. And that's a big mindset shift, I think. We do have a PhD student, Mel Henry, in the Solar Lab who's working in this space, and she's got some publications in the pipeline that will make open access.
Mel gave a talk as well. She was the inaugural speaker for the speaker series. So
there you go.
I'll put a link to it when I publish the blog. I'll also include the resources you mentioned in your PowerPoint, Pam, as well,
okay.
So access those. Okay, maybe one more. So last one, I think an important big one. If schools had to choose one area to change in our early years in literacy learning, what do you consider to be the most important? I would love your insight from Claire. So if schools had to choose one area to change in our early years of literacy, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much.
Cleo, I'm not sure whether you mean in terms of classroom practice or just a magic wand that applies to anything at all that I could change. I think if I could change one thing that I think would have maximum upstream benefit, it would be teacher knowledge about how the writing system works. The study after study after study that tells us that through no fault of their own, teachers have low knowledge about what's going on inside words. So some teachers tell us that they've done entire teaching degrees in the last 10 years and never heard the word phoneme or grapheme. So how can you work out how many phonemes there are in a word and how they map to graphemes? So one thing I would change is teacher knowledge, bearing in mind too that Hannah Stark, one of my PhD students from a few years ago, did a study where she assessed teacher knowledge, but she also asked teachers to assess their confidence. And what she found was an inverse relationship between knowledge and confidence. Now, just think about that for a moment. If you're going to get on a plane, do you want a pilot who's really confident but doesn't know very much about flying planes? Of course you don't. And that the old axiom that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing applies here. And the inverse of that is true. When you start to develop some knowledge in an area, you realize just how vast the field of knowledge is and how modest your knowledge is. So the more knowledgeable teachers actually underestimated their knowledge because they knew that there was a lot to know, but the less knowledgeable teachers were more confident. And of course, that's not a good professional space for teaching to be in.
Yeah, so important and so interesting. So thank you so much, Pam. We'll wrap it up there, I think, if that's okay with you. And look, thank you everybody for taking time to, I suppose, enlarge their own knowledge of this space. And as Pam mentioned, it's people jumping on at 7:30, 9:30 at night to do this in their own time. It is in some ways it's amazing and it's scandalous because this should be stuff that we're all taught at ITE and in our initial training. But so a huge respect to everyone who's here. Please do keep in touch and thank you again, Pam, for an absolutely phenomenal talk, and enjoy the rest of your term. Everybody who's teaching. So thank you so much.